Hey and welcome, I'm Hammeh and welcome to my complete Overwatch lore analysis of the latest Symmetra and a mysterious other character short story, Stone by Stone. We also see what will be a Marammat skin, Symmetra's restoration event. Suffice to say this contains spoilers, so timecodes in the description below if you want to skip, and there'll be a very short story synopsis right now. At the beginning of Symmetra's story, Symmetra, or Satya Viswani as her name is with Sanjay Korpal, one of the heads of Vishkar Corporation, Harita Patel, the head geologist, and Tamir Chada of PR. Vishkar leadership here is discussing an area of land near the city of Roshani in India and the development problems caused by Vishkar developing too quickly there. They have broken a statue of a famous OMNIC named Aurora in the village of Surabasa. Symmetra is sent to sort it out as Sanjay and Vishkar's representative. As she gets to the village, Symmetra receives a hostile reception but is greeted by an OMNIC monk who invites her to stay so that she might understand what the solution to the problem might be by living amongst both the people and the monks. That monk is none other than Zenyatta. As Satya helps clean up the mess of the destruction caused by Vishkar's building operations, she spends time amongst Zenyatta and fellow pilgrims and monks at the temple. She learns more about the faith of the OMNICs, including the tale of Aurora, the first sentient OMNIC, and the statue of whom has been destroyed by Vishkar's work. Understanding that Aurora, Zenyatta and herself actually have more in common than she might think. After discussing her childhood and her dancing and how it affects and informs her work as an architect, building things out of hard light, Symmetra and Zenyatta share a moment where Zenyatta equates her dancing, and even though it's not perfect as Symmetra would like it to be, that it is in some way close to the divine. With a reflection on connection with people, of being one within the iris, as Zenyatta put it, that she didn't have before, Symmetra understands what is required to fix this solution and rapidly goes to work. On the day of the great unveiling, although in Symmetra's words, picking it apart metaphorically, there is no veil, Sanjay and pretty much half of the Vishkar marketing seniors are on hand just in case of any PR crisis. However, Symmetra has nailed the solution. Zenyatta had explained to her about various Japanese philosophies and the art of kintsugi. When things are broken, like ceramics, the pieces are gathered together and mended with gold. Symmetra does the same with the temple and the same with the statue, but not only mends the cracks and gaps with gold, she then goes one step further and transforms the statue in a mesmerizing hard light weaving dance with golden threads. She changes the statue into a representation of a bas-relief she saw on the wall, that of Aurora attaining transcendence. With Symmetra being welcomed back to the temple any time and given a parting gift by Zenyatta, that leaves her to talk to Sanjay, who is confused at the solution that she's come to and perhaps a little surprised. Symmetra says that there is a lot of work that Vishkar could do if they tried to connect and to understand with people in the way that she's been taught to. And with Sanjay seemingly agreeing with her, the story ends. So what have we learnt? Well, at number 9, we learnt a little bit more about the Vishkar Corporation. We have seen before their dealings in development in Mexico around the events of Sombra's ARG and the Dorado story of the power plant and works there. We've also seen more recently, both in Lucio's backstory and also the events of the hero of Numbani, Overwatch's first novel if you've read that, and if not you should, as well as Symmetra's original comic, A Better World, about the Vishkar Corporation's efforts in Rio and how eventually they were driven out in somewhat of an uprising by Lucio. It seems that so soon, and more on that later after Rio, Vishkar are having more problems. It seems that their development too much and too soon, in the words of Patel, the head geologist, have caused seismic damage or damage of some kind to a shrine to a temple in a nearby village. Not only do we see Sanjay's and Vishkar's tactics in dispatching Symmetra, given that she came from a small village similar to the one in question, and maybe, in Sanjay's opinion, the villagers will somehow connect with her, that they have a certain solution or playbook for these kind of things, as Symmetra is told to offer money, a new temple, or in her words, that at one point come quickly, automatically to her. Vishkar wants to make things better for everyone. I have worked on many projects that have improved lives by providing houses, clean drinking water, clinics, and then in Symmetra's head, she says luxury retreats, exclusive clubs, condominiums with prices as high as the skyscrapers that contained them. After the events of A Better World, where Symmetra was having doubts, we can see that her view on these things is still being challenged. She is still doubting. And if we didn't know already, we get another view on how Vishkar are perceived as a company, and this is in, of course, their native India. We're going to lose this window. We've got to give Sravasa, the village, something important to show how upset we are that we accidentally damaged something so precious to them, says Sanjay. Symmetra in her head says, we are not upset about that. She had gotten used to this at Vishkar, in the words of Christie Golden, who we have fantastically writing this story. And as Symmetra gets to Sravasa, the villagers make their opinions known. When she says she's here to help and to make things right. To do what? Build a skyscraper with glittering blue hard light? You think that's what we want? I do not know what you want, Satya said simply. Of course you don't, someone cried. Vishkar doesn't care, yelled someone else. I care, Satya said. So, although Symmetra is trying to make things good through her presence, she's clearly up against it in terms of Vishkar's general reputation. And of course, word about Rio has gotten around. At number 8, we see a different perspective on Sanjay Korpal. Now, we've seen him before with Symmetra in Rio, in the events of A Better World, and the side of his negotiating personality, but also the very ruthless part of that story where he actually destroyed the offices of an architect who was threatening Vishkar's plans, and the resulting collateral damage and the hurting of a child that Symmetra had found earlier. Even though she rescued her, this whole scene really affected Satya. In the beginning of this story, Sanjay is joking about a convenient earthquake, or hoping it was a convenient earthquake, rather than actually Vishkar's fault that this damage was caused to the town and to the statue. Now, Sanjay, of course, we have seen in various Overwatch media properties at the Talon High Table. We know that he is working with, or certainly talking with, Doomfist, Reaper, Moira, and other people on a similar level. So it's interesting to see him in this day-to-day context here, and also him potentially being a little bit more, I'm going to say it, human. It's a different side to him than sort of the villain that we've seen so far. That doesn't mean that he's not on the side of bad, but it kind of balances his character out a little bit more, seeing him in this more human form. When he dispatches Symmetra to go and try and solve the problem at the beginning of the story, he gave her one of his warm smiles, his eyes kind. I know you can. Do whatever it takes. So, whether he is genuinely being kind to Symmetra or whether he is simply getting her to do what he wants, it's interesting to see that happen. At the end, when she solved it in a way that Sanjay honestly didn't expect, it said that he looked puzzled, not necessarily angry, although of course Symmetra is struggling perhaps to read his emotions for reasons that we'll discuss in another point. If he's worked with her for a long time, Sanjay certainly gets a sense of how Symmetra is feeling. He says at the end, "Seems you've left a bit of yourself here. Will you miss this place?" And at the end, Sanjay seems perplexed at Symmetra's answer when she says that Vishkar should interact with people with respect. He actually says in a soft voice and an almost surprised voice, according to Symmetra, "I think you may be right." Now, is that Sanjay putting it on, or how does that reconcile with him being on the board of Talon as a character? I'm really interested to find out more about Sanjay's character after this short story in particular. It seems that there might be a bit more to him than we've seen so far. At number 7, we get a nice little bit of context as to where this is set in the Overwatch world, and indeed the timeline of such. Given that this is a problem so soon after Rio for Vishkar, we know that this is not really too far from the events of not only Lucio's bio, also actually Orisa's Hero of Numbani, if you've read the book. In this particular passage, in a conversation with Lucio, Ify, the star of the story alongside Orisa, had heard of how Vishkar had treated the citizens of Rio, the citizens' revolution, and driving Vishkar out of some neighbourhoods, although it had taken many rallies and uprisings and there had been many, many losses. Coupled with a discussion between Zenyatta and Symmetra regarding Mondata and his death, we know that this is certainly after the events of Rio, also after the events of Recall and the animated shorts around Overwatch's launch, and along with the events of the Hero of Numbani novel, we know that actually a lot of events after the Recall are in a relatively condensed period of time. So although it's been many years since Overwatch launched and we saw the Recall and the live cinematics, nowhere near 4 years has passed in the events of the Overwatch timeline. At number 6, we learn a whole bunch about Symmetra, about Satya Viswani and her personality. Firstly, we learn about her childhood. After she was identified as one of the few capable of becoming a light-bending architect, so says her bio on the website, she was plucked from extreme poverty and placed in the care of Vishkar's Architect Academy, never to return home. Isolated and lonely in her new life, Satya immersed herself in her education and training. Now, we do get some more details on things she remembered or enjoyed and didn't from her childhood. One good thing apparently was occasional visits to peaceful temples. At numerous points in the short story, the smell of incense is familiar and comfortable to her. However, when she and the monks go and help and feed the people of the village in the neighbourhood, thoughts of the desperate poverty of her childhood splattered across her mind's eye, the stench, the press of people, the empty bellies, the murky drinking water, and the helplessness of her parents to do anything about it. Now, given that this is the second time that Symmetra has come up in lore after her comic, it may be that the precise story of how she was separated from her parents when she was young might be one for another time, but we do get a hint that it was certainly very, very young. We do see in one conversation or thought about Zenyatta that Satya had not been old enough to really understand faith and religion before she'd been selected by Vishkar Corporation and trained as a hard-light architect. This, oh how she wished she had heard it before now, when she has a bit of enlightenment in conversation with Zen. More context on dancing and the meaning of it in her childhood. At the same time, I've always found it hard to sit still. The orb rolled from one hand to the other. But when I create, I use Kartik dance movements. As a child, when I felt agitated, dancing calmed me. I find the meditations with this, she indicated the orb, calm me too. Satya avoided his gaze. She did not often discuss how personal the craft was to her. At number 5, we have Symmetra and her autism and the way in which it's depicted. Now, since the events of A Better World, the fourth Overwatch digital comic, way back in 2016 actually, we knew that Symmetra was on the spectrum, both in terms of the comic phrasing, as I show here, and also the writer Andrew Robinson confirming on Twitter. Since then, there has been a lot of praise for the depiction of Symmetra's autism, and it's continued sympathetically and occasionally in a way where we're laughing with Symmetra and Zenyatta, as the two find that they, in some of the characteristics, have a lot more in common than they previously thought. This had been shown in the previous comic, A Better World, but Symmetra focuses and enjoys and appreciates order. In this story, she had set routines, which ensured there was always order and calm in some part of her life, even in hotels. Satya had time alone and cleaved to her routines as much as possible. This is the reason why going from what she was thinking was going to happen to actually staying with the monks, this change of plan was very uncomfortable feeling for Satya. Another personality character trait mentioned a few times is Satya interpreting things very literally. For example, in one interchange when Zenyatta talks about building bridges between omnics and humans. Building? Oh, Satya said. The first bridge that came into my head was a literal one. I too was quite literal at first. Although omnics share sentience with humans, I found them so perplexing. They would say things such as, lend a hand, or cat's got your tongue. But their hands were flesh, not metal. How could they lend one? How might a cat obtain their tongues? Were tongues detachable? I had some very interesting pictures in my head for a long time. Zen and Symmetra having a little laugh and back and forth there. Symmetra also struggles on occasion, and Zen relates to her with this in terms of observing emotional and social cues and situations. In one piece, it says, Satya did not think she would ever learn to read the subtle changes that conveyed omnic emotions, but she felt there was no other word for it, that Zenyatta was deeply moved. This was when Symmetra says there's always more that you can learn from a good teacher at the end of her stay with Zen. Now, I am no expert on the spectrum, but from what I've read and most reactions, it seems to have been very, very sensitively and thoughtfully done. So, full credit to Christie Golden and to the Overwatch team here. And there do seem to be many other references and many other ways in which Symmetra expresses herself in the story as well. So, really do read it through and appreciate it. I really, really enjoyed it. At number 3, we have OMNIC Lore, Aurora and OMNIC Sentience. Now we get through the eyes of Zen and his interaction with Symmetra, as well as the story of this temple, of this statue, a bit into how OMNIC Sentience came to be. We are told about Aurora as the first sentient OMNIC who sacrificed herself in order to grant sentience to all others. She was more than simply a famous OMNIC, and at the beginning of the story, this is why Symmetra, recognizing the name, says that they can't just do the normal solutions here. Aurora was not a deity, Zenyatta corrected Symmetra at one point in the story. She was just like us, except she was the first. The OMNICs do not worship her, they reflect on her life and death, they offer gratitude for her sacrifice and the gift she gave us. Now, Aurora has a story around her. She was curious, she wanted to learn about the world and its people, to understand what makes humans human. And Zenyatta nodded at this when Symmetra mentioned it. All OMNICs see a bit of themselves within her. Now, Aurora apparently visited this temple on a pilgrimage, on a journey that she made, growing with each place she visited, each person that she met. The story goes that her physical journey, according to Zen, took her to Shambhala. Her spiritual journey to a place of such selflessness that she would sacrifice herself on the mere chance that OMNICs too could also experience sentience. Apparently she didn't know it would work, whatever she did. Zen said no one could be sure. It was possible she could die in the attempt, and any chance of OMNIC sentience would die with her. So this is why when the statue was destroyed, that people were so devastated. Now, when Aurora sacrificed herself, apparently she transcended this existence, this way of being, and Shambhala monks strive to emulate her experience through meditating. Now, the story as to what exactly happened to her is kind of mixed up. Zen hesitated for a moment. Only the handful of people in her physical presence bore witness to what occurred, and over time, of course, the mystery has only grown deeper. It is said she was engulfed in a great golden light. She expanded, and we strive to reach that place, that level of being which we call the iris. There we are all one. So, putting a few little pieces together, I think we can say that Aurora went to the site of the Shambhala monastery in Nepal, the level that we play, of course, in Overwatch, and perhaps the inner sanctum, that area, that light structure there, is kind of a recreation, a representation, a shrine, as it were, to this moment where Aurora transcended. Now, interestingly, around the temple in this story are bas-reliefs of the moment of her transcendence, and this depiction is pretty much Zenyatta's look, his animation when he does his transcendence in game. So, by putting things together, I guess we can say that Aurora's journey when she was the first OMNIC who became conscious ended up at Nepal, where she apparently sacrificed herself in some manner that caused her consciousness to be shared amongst all OMNICs. Now, the interesting thing about Zen forgetting this story is that, technically speaking, if this was perhaps, before or during the first OMNIC crisis, it's not that long ago. It's not like this is thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago. It's a few decades ago at the very most. So it's interesting that the story has got confused and lost in the telling. It's an awesome story, I really, really love it, and I hope personally that Aurora is a real figure in the Overwatch world, or was a real figure in the Overwatch world, and that all of this stuff happened, regardless of the details, because it's a really cool way to explain how OMNICs got to their sentience, as it were. Maybe, who knows, it could even have some ties as to how either the first OMNIC crisis started, or indeed was ended too. So, whatever this sentience is, we still don't quite get an answer to what it precisely is technically, although we do get the story that, of course, Zenyatta and other OMNICs believe. When the two are discussing Mandata's death, Symmetra says, "Before that, I did not realise OMNICs could die. You are machines. I'd assumed you could replace parts." In theory, yes, but replacement parts have yet to be found for a soul, be it human or OMNIC. Did OMNICs have souls? That was a very large question, and Satya needed time to think about it. So, not one for this short story. At number 3, we learn a whole bunch of Zenyatta Lore. Now, mentioning Zenyatta Lore in a meme sense on any social network is a great way of getting hundreds of likes. I should learn to be a better content creator and do it more often, but the meme status of Zenyatta being effectively lawless since Overwatch's launch, apart from his bio on the website, is well known. However, we get a whole bunch of Zen and OMNIC lore here, as this story is a real dig into the character of Zenyatta and of Symmetra, so loads of goodness for all you Zen fans. The first cool thing that we hear is what his voice sounds like. Part of it was jarring, like nails on chalkboard, but the undertone was soothing. The OMNIC who fell into step beside her, as Symmetra says, was the same one who had granted her permission to enter. No one knows what another wants without getting to know them first. As he guides Symmetra through her journey of discovering, of learning about OMNICs and of the significance of this temple and statue to them, as well as the local population, we see a lot of Zenyatta's character. His expressions, for example, he cocks his head when he observes Symmetra's discomfort at apparently being asked to stay with them to disrupt her routine for a while. He's very, very good at relating with people. He finds a way. He relates to Symmetra in terms of talking about his confusion at human metaphors, for example, as we've already discussed. His sense of humour. He's cracking jokes a lot, like in his voice lines. OMNICs being able to cook without being able to taste the food that they're cooking is a subject that the two discuss. Given Zenyatta's explanation as to how the OMNICs get feedback from people surrounding them as to how the ingredients are used and observe cooking being done, Symmetra says, "Given that, frankly, I'm amazed it's not terrible." "So were our first guests," Zenyatta said, and laughed. She liked his laugh, that he was able to do so freely, at himself or at the absurdity of other things. Now, Zen is particularly well studied, including Japanese philosophy, or so it seems. He's taken a look at aesthetic philosophy called wabi-sabi, basically meaning that imperfection should be embraced and appreciated, and indeed he resonates with Symmetra when he talks about how her dancing is like this, but it's still beautiful and important later in the story. He also talks about kintsugi, the golden joinery known in Japan. When ceramic is broken, then the pieces are gathered and put back together, but mended with gold effects or gold. And indeed, it's this technique that Symmetra blends with her hard light mastery as an architect in her restoration and repair of not only the temple, but also her interpretation and transformation of the statue itself after she hears of Aurora's story from Zenyatta. So for you Zenyatta fans, a wonderful story with so much Zen character and nuance shown, even more than I've said here, and with his appearance in the Overwatch 2 gameplay trailer, with Genji visiting him in Nepal, the home of the Shambali. There's probably more to come from Zen, so keep an eye out for that. More Zen on the way soon, I think. Hopefully, maybe in 2021.
I knew you would return one day.
It has been too long, Master.
At number 2, and as much for the elegance and wonder of the writing of Christie Golden, there's a wonderful way in which we learn about how Symmetra manipulates and uses hard light. The colour of the light, as we see the restored temple, is golden. Symmetra's hard light interpretation of kintsugi, as she has been listening to Zenyatta. There are wonderful terms. Honey-hued, aureate is a wonderful word. AU, of course, the symbol, chemical element for gold as well. And amazing scenes of Symmetra dancing and thinking of the experiences of Aurora as she weaves additional pieces around the statue in the unveiling, as she puts it. She weaves light to create orbs of meditation, the 6 arms to put Aurora in the pose of the bas-relief of her transcendence. She then uses the gauntlet at the very end to coalesce light into threads, tiny threads that get captured and fixed into position. I almost see it as a spider spinning threads into solid silk, but Symmetra makes this a form of dance. She lifted her arms, settled herself, and began to weave. She reached into empty air, fingertips sensing, grasping, pulling, shifting the orb back and forth, shifting perception, stretching the thin strand of golden-hued light between her fingers, gathering radiant threads into a ball. It's described in the story as the dance of creation, and it sounds like a visual spectacle as much as an industrial building process. It's beautifully written and described, and really enjoy it in the story if you haven't already. This display, this dance, it's kind of a fine, sort of orchestral almost example. I wonder what it looks like when Symmetra is working on something like Utopia, the city we know that is built by Vishkar in India, almost entirely with large amounts of hard light used in its construction. What must this look like when you're putting up a building, when you're putting up a skyscraper? I'd love to see that. Last but not least, we get an idea of Symmetra's position and sense in the Overwatch world. Now, we do see at several points, as I've highlighted during this story, that she still has her doubts, and indeed some of these are getting compounded. She understands that Vishkar don't really care, perhaps in the way that Sanjay says. She understands that Vishkar are not well thought of in the world. In the events of A Better World, her comic, the events of Rio, we know that Symmetra was having doubts about how Sanjay operated in particular, but whether Vishkar were really making things better. At the end of this, she almost makes a statement to Sanjay that Vishkar can do things differently, that this is how they should work with people, and that as she walks away, Sanjay kind of softly, almost confusedly says to himself, maybe you're actually right. Is this an act from Sanjay? Is Satya trying to find ways to stay within the order, stay within the structure of this life that really, since she was young, is all she has known? Is she trying to improve and change Vishkar rather than perhaps leave it? One thing's for sure, Symmetra, unlike some other characters that we've seen from Overwatch at the end of other stories or comics or media, there's a great piece of interesting information at the end of The Hero of Numbani, but you're going to have to watch one of my videos on that or go and buy the book yourself. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to Symmetra. Not everyone has to pick a side in this upcoming, it seems, events of Overwatch 2. Some of them might be looking after things elsewhere in the world. You can't have everyone on one side or everyone on the other, perhaps, in this conflict. The Overwatch world has been built out to be slowly more nuanced than that, and life of course has to go on, and of course people like the Junkers may just roam around. So Symmetra at the end of this is not thinking perhaps that she's going to leave, but it'll be interesting to see how her next Vishkar operation goes, and whether this change of mind, this sort of alternative perspective that Sanjay is kind of talking to her about, or talking to himself about, is something that is really part of Sanjay Korpal's character or not. Either way, amazing story, really enjoyed it, and brilliant to have Christie Golden writing in the Overwatch universe. She has written everything from Buffy in the past, through to Star Trek, through to working on Star Wars, and then of course working with Blizzard on World of Warcraft and a host of other things besides. But this is the first time she's written in Overwatch, so it's great to have her with us in the Overwatch Lore community as well as the wider Blizzard Lore community too. Do pop over and say hello to her on Twitter at Christie Golden if you enjoyed the story. Thanks very much for tuning in. If you like this video, throw a like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you thought, what your favourite moments are in the comments below. I'd love to hear, as always. Do check out all my other videos. I've gone through the details of every other short story, comic, animated short, every single piece of Overwatch lore over the time since Overwatch released, and even before, way back to when it was announced at BlizzCon many years ago for the first time. Do check out all of the playlists here. If you like videos like this, they would not exist without you guys liking, subscribing and sharing them, and they also wouldn't exist without my patrons on Patreon. I'm actually revamping the Patreon. I'm going to be pushing the channel forward and expanding into more lore of more games, books, TV series and a bunch of other things, but more on that in the Patreon. If you'd like to support my channel from just $1, £1 or a coin to your Witcher a month, check out patreon.com/Hammeh on how to get involved. Cheers for tuning in. I've been Hammeh. Take it easy.